A man in a canvas work coat, 6 feet 4 inches of absolute stillness, standing in the open doorway of a lumberyard office in Sheridan, Wyoming. November 1961. The kind of cold that gets into your collar before you've taken your second step. Behind him, the main street of Sheridan is going about its Tuesday morning. Trucks idling, a dog nosing at a trash barrel, 2 women hurrying past with their heads down. But inside that office, nobody is moving. Not the 2 men in suits standing behind the desk. Not the young woman gripping a stack of ledger books to her chest like they're the last thing she owns in this world. Because at that moment, they might be. Not the older man seated in the chair across from those suits, his knuckles white on the armrests, his jaw set in a way that tells you he's already done the arithmetic and doesn't like the answer. The man in the doorway doesn't say a word. He just stands there, filling the frame the way he fills every frame he's ever occupied. And he lets the temperature of the room settle around him the way a stone settles into still water. One of the suits turns and looks at him. And here's the thing about that look. It isn't recognition. Not yet. It's irritation. The look of a man who has just been interrupted mid-transaction and does not appreciate the interruption. He would come to appreciate it. Just not yet. This is that story. To understand what happened inside that office on the morning of Tuesday, November 14th, 1961, you need to understand 3 things. What Sheridan, Wyoming was in 1961, what the Callaway Lumber Company was to the people of that town, and what a bank workout specialist named Gerald Fitch believed he was entitled to do when a small business fell behind on its notes. Sheridan in November is a particular kind of beautiful and a particular kind of brutal. The Bighorn Mountains sit to the southwest like a promise, white-capped, silent, indifferent. The town itself was running about 10,300 people that year, a working community built on ranching, coal, and timber. Main Street ran clean and wide. There was a JCPenney, a hardware store, 3 diners, and 2 banks. The kind of town where a man's handshake still meant more than his signature on a document, and where everyone within a 6-block radius knew your name and your father's name. Callaway Lumber had been on Caffeine Avenue since 1928. 33 years. Roy Callaway, the original Roy, the grandfather, had started it with a single flatbed truck and a lease on a warehouse that leaked in 3 places. By 1945, the company had 12 employees, a full timber yard, and a reputation for cutting straight and delivering on time. By 1955, when Roy's son Daniel took over the operation, Callaway Lumber was supplying material for residential construction across 4 counties. They had 21 full-time employees, a payroll that met every Friday without fail. Daniel Callaway was 44 years old in November of 1961. A quiet man, served in the Pacific, came home, went back to work. He'd taken 2 loans against the business in the late 1950s. One to expand the yard, one to purchase a new mill saw that could handle the volume the Wyoming housing boom was demanding. Both loans came from First Territorial Bank of Sheridan. Both were, on paper, manageable. Then 1960 happened. The housing market in Wyoming didn't collapse, it stalled. Construction starts in Sheridan County dropped 34% between the first quarter of 1960 and the third quarter of 1961. That's not a rumor. That's the figure from the Wyoming State Planning Commission, published in their annual economic survey. A 34% drop in the exact market sector your business depends on. Daniel Callaway fell behind on the notes. He fell behind by 4 months on the expansion loan, $2,240 in arrears, and by 2 months on the equipment loan. He had been in contact with his bank officer. He had proposed a restructured payment schedule. He had documentation showing the business was still operationally sound, still meeting payroll, still holding its supplier relationships. He was, by every reasonable measure, a man managing a difficult period with discipline and transparency. But here's where it changes. First Territorial Bank had, earlier that year, been acquired by a holding company out of Denver called Rocky Mountain Commercial Trust. And Rocky Mountain Commercial Trust had a man they sent into situations like Daniel Callaway's. His name was Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch was 41 years old, a graduate of the University of Denver School of Business, and he had spent the last 7 years specializing in what the industry called workout cases. That is a polite term for the process by which a bank extracts maximum value from a defaulting loan while minimizing its own exposure. Fitch was very good at this. In the previous 3 years alone, he had successfully called notes on 11 small businesses across Colorado and Wyoming. He had a conversion rate, that's the term his superiors used, of over 80%. He closed cases. On the morning of November 14th, Fitch arrived at the Callaway Lumber office at 8:47 a.m. with one associate, a junior loan officer named Bryce Alderman. Fitch was carrying a briefcase containing a formal acceleration notice, a document that, once served, would trigger the full and immediate repayment of both outstanding loans. Not the arrears, the entire outstanding balance. Combined, that figure was $31,400, a number that in 1961 Wyoming, for a timber yard carrying a slowed inventory, was not a number you could produce on a Tuesday morning. Daniel's daughter, Margaret, 22 years old, running the office books since graduating Sheridan College the previous spring, was the first to see them come through the door. She would later describe the feeling as watching a door close that you didn't know was open. Daniel was already seated at his desk. He'd been expecting some kind of response to his restructuring proposal. He had not expected this. Fitch was not rude. That was the part people who weren't in the room sometimes misunderstood. He wasn't loud. He didn't threaten. He was precise, professional, and completely unmovable. He had the documentation. He had the legal standing. And he had done this 11 times before. He laid the acceleration notice on Daniel Callaway's desk at 8:52 a.m. and explained in orderly terms that Daniel had 48 hours to produce $31,400, or the bank would begin proceedings to take possession of the property, the equipment, and the remaining inventory. Margaret Callaway was still holding the ledger books when she heard the front door of the office open at 9:04 a.m. and a man she recognized from every movie theater in Wyoming filled the doorway without a word. John Wayne had been in the Sheridan area since the first week of November. He was not there for any project that has ever made it into a press release or a studio filing. He was there because a friend of his, a horse trainer named Bud Larson, who had worked on 6 of Wayne's westerns between 1952 and 1959, had recently purchased a small breeding ranch outside of town and had invited Wayne up to look at a quarter-horse bloodline he was developing. Wayne had come quietly, the way he often came to places that weren't Los Angeles. No publicist. No studio escort. A truck, a jacket, and 2 days that belonged to nobody but him. He was 54 years old. 27 years in Hollywood. 142 films. He was, by November of 1961, the #1 box office draw in the United States, a position he had held, with only brief interruptions, for over a decade. He had just finished production on The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance that September. He had the kind of cultural gravity that made rooms rearrange themselves before he walked through the door. None of that is why he walked through the door of Callaway Lumber that morning. He had stopped in the lumber yard the previous Friday to pick up cedar fencing materials for Bud Larson's property. He'd spent 40 minutes there, talked to 2 of the yard workers, ate a sandwich out of a paper bag on the tailgate of his truck. He had noticed, the way a man who has spent his life watching other people perform notices things, that the people who worked in that yard carried themselves with a particular kind of pride. Not arrogance. The pride of people who believe that what they do matters and who have been told often enough that they're right. He'd mentioned to Bud Larson that evening that it was a good outfit. Bud had told him about the loans, about the stalled construction market, about Daniel Callaway's restructuring proposal. Wayne had listened without comment. But here's what nobody in that office on Tuesday morning knew. Wayne had driven past Callaway Lumber on his way out of town that morning. He'd seen the Denver plates on a car he didn't recognize parked in front of the office. He'd read something in that detail, the specific rental car cleanliness of the vehicle, the briefcase visible through the window, the way a man reads weather in a cloud formation. He turned his truck around. He stood in the doorway now, one hand on the doorframe, not gripping it, resting on it, the way a man rests his hand on a fence post he's checked 100 times and knows is solid. His hands were broad, thickly knuckled, the kind of hands that don't look like a movie star's hands and never did. His eyes moved across the room once and didn't move again. Gerald Fitch turned from the desk and looked at him. The look on Fitch's face was the look of a man who is very confident in what he is doing and has just been mildly inconvenienced by an interruption. He did not yet know who he was looking at. Or perhaps more precisely, he knew the face, but he did not yet understand what the face being attached to a physical presence in this particular room was going to mean for his morning. That misunderstanding, and what it cost him, is what we're here to talk about. Fitch spoke first. He almost always spoke first. "Sir, this is a private business matter. If you're here for the yard, you'll need to come back later. The words were not hostile. They were dismissive, which is a different and, in certain contexts, more consequential thing. Dismissal assumes a power differential. It assumes that the person being dismissed will accept the premise. Wayne didn't move. He looked at Daniel Calloway, not at Fitch. Daniel Calloway's face told him everything he needed to know about the 47 minutes that had preceded his arrival. Then he looked at Margaret, still holding the ledger books, her jaw set at the same angle as her father's. "Daniel," Wayne said. Not loudly. The kind of voice that carries because the room decides to carry it. "What do they have on paper?" Fitch set down his pen. "Excuse me, this is I heard you," Wayne said. Still not looking at him. Still looking at Daniel Calloway. There is a technique that military men and experienced horsemen both know, though they may call it by different names. The refusal to accept another party's framing of a situation. Fitch had framed this as a private matter into which Wayne had intruded. Wayne had simply declined to inhabit that frame. He had not argued with it. He had not acknowledged it. He had redirected to the substantive question as though the frame didn't exist, which, for Wayne's purposes, it didn't. Bryce Alderman, the junior associate, had recognized Wayne approximately 4 seconds after he appeared in the doorway. Alderman was 26 years old, from Laramie, and had grown up watching John Wayne films on Saturday afternoons. He was now watching John Wayne stand 6 feet from him in a lumberyard office, and he would later tell his wife that it felt less like meeting a celebrity and more like suddenly understanding a word he'd been mispronouncing his whole life. Fitch, to his credit, did not immediately back down. 7 years in workout cases had given him a specific kind of institutional confidence. The confidence of a man who knows he has the documents and believes the documents are the argument. He stepped around the side of the desk with the practiced authority of a man who has physically repositioned himself in small offices dozens of times to reassert spatial dominance. "I don't know who you are," Fitch said, though by this point that wasn't entirely true. "But this is a legal proceeding and your presence here is not appropriate. I'd ask you to leave." The room went silent. Margaret Calloway stopped breathing. Daniel Calloway's hands tightened on the armrests. The only sound was the faint settling creak of the building frame in the November wind. Wayne finally turned and looked at Gerald Fitch directly. Not with anger. With a quality of attention that was, by every account of the people who experienced it firsthand, somewhat unnerving in its completeness. "You're calling the full note," Wayne said. "Not a question." Fitch paused. "The bank is exercising its rights under the loan agreement, yes. 48 hours. That is the notice period, correct?" Wayne nodded once, slowly, as though confirming something to himself. Then he said the sentence that nobody in that room expected. "I'd like to see the restructuring proposal Daniel submitted." Fitch stared at him. "That's proprietary bank documentation." "Margaret," Wayne said, still without looking away from Fitch, "do you have a copy of what your father sent to the bank?" Margaret Calloway said, years later, that she wasn't sure why she answered. She said it was something about the way he asked, as though it was entirely reasonable, as though the outcome were not in any doubt, as though the fact that Fitch was standing between her and the answer was an obstacle of the same order as a stuck file drawer. She set down the ledger books. She went to the filing cabinet. She pulled the folder. What happened next, nobody in that room expected. Wayne took the folder from Margaret without opening it. He held it at his side and looked at Fitch. "You came up from Denver," Wayne said. Fitch didn't answer immediately. "Our offices are in Denver, yes. Rocky Mountain Commercial Trust." Another pause. "That's correct. You've called 11 notes in the last 3 years." In the first second, Fitch's expression moved through surprise and into a kind of recalibration. He was not accustomed to being the subject of the research. In the second, he made the decision to maintain his position. He straightened slightly, reset his shoulders. In the third second, he made the mistake of believing this was still a conversation he controlled. "I'm not sure what you think you know about my firm's business practices," Fitch said. Wayne opened the folder. He read it, not performed reading, not the theatrical skimming of a man making a point, but the focused, unhurried reading of a man who spent years on film sets where reading a contract wrong cost people money and time that neither they nor he had to spare. He read for approximately 90 seconds. Nobody on that set moved. Then he closed the folder. "Daniel's arrears on the expansion note are $2,240, Wayne said. His arrears on the equipment note are $890. That's $3,130 total past due. You're calling $31,400 because the loan documents allow acceleration on default, and 4 months behind is default. Fitch said, "That is a correct statement of the situation. The restructuring proposal asks for a 6-month payment deferral on the expansion note principal, maintained interest payments, and a 9-month cure period to bring the arrears current." Daniel has 21 employees. He has supplier relationships in good standing. His operational accounts show positive monthly cash flow since March. The bank has evaluated. The bank, Wayne said, and now there was something in the word, not heat, not volume, but a quality of weight that made heat and volume unnecessary. Hasn't evaluated anything. You've been sent here to close a case. Nobody on that set moved. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds in a small office with 4 other people in it, and a November wind finding every gap in the window seals. 4 seconds is not a long time unless you are Gerald Fitch, and you are slowly understanding that every premise on which you built the morning has just been dismantled with 6 sentences. That's not legal argument. That's not leverage. That's clarity, which is a different and more durable instrument. Fitch's training told him to reassert procedural standing. He tried. The bank's legal position is... Your legal position is solid, Wayne said. I'm not arguing your legal position. I'm telling you what the numbers say about this business, which is different from what your file says about this loan. He set the folder on Daniel Calloway's desk. He turned to face Fitch fully, and this was the moment that Bryce Alderman would describe for the rest of his life to anyone who would listen. The moment he would bring up at dinner parties in Laramie and later in Denver. The moment he would tell his children about when they were old enough to understand what the word presence actually means. Wayne was not menacing. He was not performing. He was simply there, all 6 feet 4 inches and 220 pounds of him, in a canvas work coat that had seen genuine use, with hands that had roped horses and thrown hay bales and spent 27 years doing physical work on film sets in ways that studios never put in the press materials. And he was looking at Gerald Fitch the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved and is now explaining to the room. I'll cover Daniel's arrears today, Wayne said. Cash. That brings the notes current. Current notes can't be accelerated. The physical consequence was immediate. Fitch's briefcase handle clicked against his wrist as his hand went involuntarily to it. It was a small motion, barely perceptible, but it told everyone in the room that the morning had changed. Fitch said very carefully, "That would be at Daniel Calloway's discretion to accept." Wayne turned to Daniel, not asking permission, confirming a direction he'd already chosen. Daniel Calloway looked at him for a long moment. There was, in that look, something complicated, a pride that did not want to yield, measured against the face of his daughter, measured against 21 employees, measured against 33 years of his family's name on a building. He said, "I can repay you." "I know," Wayne said. And then, this is the part that never made it into any newspaper account, that survives only in the memories of the 4 people who were in the room. He said, "That's not why I'm doing it." He stepped back. Not all the way to the door, just back. The way he always stepped back. The way a man steps back from a fire once the wood is caught and the work is done. Fitch picked up the acceleration notice from Daniel's desk. He tapped it once against his palm. He put it back in the briefcase. He looked at Wayne one more time with an expression that was not defeat and not anger, but something closer to the look of a man who has just seen a thing done that he did not know could be done that way. He said, to no one in particular, "We'll need to process the payment through the branch." Wayne said, "I know where the branch is." The Sheridan branch of First Territorial Bank processed the payment at 11:23 that same morning. Wayne paid $3,130 in cash, drawn against an account he maintained at a Sheridan bank, which tells you something about how he moved through places he cared about. He paid it as a personal loan to Daniel Calloway, documented on a single handwritten page, at 0 interest, repayable on whatever schedule Daniel could manage. Fitch was present for the transaction. He didn't have to be. Bryce Alderman could have handled the paperwork, but he was there. Sometimes a man needs to see the end of a thing before he can understand it. Afterward, in the parking lot outside the bank, Fitch stopped Wayne. This is the conversation that has never been fully reported. Partly because there were no other witnesses, partly because neither man gave interviews about it, and partly because the conversations that matter most are almost always the ones held in parking lots in cold weather between people who have no audience left. Fitch said, "You didn't have to do that." Wayne looked at him for a moment. Not unkindly. I know, Wayne said. Those loans were legitimately in default. The bank was within its rights. Still is, Wayne said. A thing being legal and a thing being right aren't the same conversation. Fitch was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had built a professional identity on the premise that those two conversations were identical. That rights, properly documented, constituted the full extent of what was owed and what was permissible. 7 years. 11 cases. He had never once stopped to separate the two conversations, because separating them would have made his job impossible. That family, Fitch said, isn't the only one in a situation like that. Wayne said, I know that too. What he didn't say, what Fitch would piece together over the following months, was the rest of the principle, which is this: you cannot fix everything. You cannot cover every note in every lumber yard in Wyoming. But you can when you are standing in a specific doorway on a specific Tuesday morning, and you have both the means and the clarity to act. Do the particular thing that is in front of you. The scale of what you cannot do is not an argument against doing what you can. Fitch looked at him for a long moment. Then he put out his hand. Wayne shook it. No cameras. No audience. No lines to remember. Just two men in a parking lot in November, one of whom had just been handed a lesson that would take him years to fully understand, and one of whom already knew it so completely that he hadn't needed to raise his voice to deliver it. You're not what I expected, Fitch said. Wayne picked up his keys. Most things worth knowing aren't. Years later, specifically the spring of 1974, Gerald Fitch left Rocky Mountain Commercial Trust. He had been with the firm for 19 years by that point, had managed over 40 workout cases, had a career that by every external measure was successful. He left to take a position with a community development lending organization based in Boulder, Colorado. The organization's purpose was to provide restructuring assistance to small businesses in underserved rural markets. Exactly as it happened, the kind of assistance that Daniel Calloway had been asking for in November of 1961. His colleagues at Rocky Mountain Commercial Trust were surprised by the move. Fitch had never spoken publicly about why he made it. In a letter he wrote to a former mentor at the University of Denver, a letter that his mentor later donated to the university's business school archive, Fitch mentioned, in passing, a transaction in Wyoming in 1961 that I have been thinking about ever since. He ran the community development program for 11 years. Under his tenure, the organization restructured loans for 340 small businesses across Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico. The methodology he developed, which emphasized operational cash flow analysis over strict collateral valuation, and which built graduated cure periods into default responses, was adopted by 4 other regional lending organizations by 1983. It is still in use in modified form in 2 of those organizations today. Bryce Alderman, the junior associate who stood in the corner of that office and watched everything, went on to become a commercial banker in Laramie. He later served on the board of a Wyoming small business advocacy organization. He named his eldest son Wayne, which his wife thought was a fine name and which Alderman never fully explained, except to say once, at a retirement dinner in 2003, that it was in honor of someone who had taught him that the measure of a man was not what he was entitled to do, but what he chose to do when those weren't the same thing. Calloway Lumber stayed open. Daniel Calloway repaid Wayne's personal loan in full by February of 1963, 14 months after the transaction, a full year ahead of any schedule they'd discussed. He sent a handwritten note with the final payment. Wayne kept it. The business stayed in the family. Margaret Calloway took over operations in 1971 when her father's health declined. She ran it until 1988. Calloway Lumber closed in 1994, not from financial pressure, but because Margaret retired and her children had chosen other lives, which is a different kind of ending and a better one. Now come back to that doorway. Come back to the man in the canvas coat, the frozen moment, the 2 suits at the desk, the girl holding the ledger books, the older man with white knuckles on the armrests. Come back to the November cold and the rental car with Denver plates and the briefcase on the desk. The question the opening image asked was simple. What does a man do when he has the power to walk away, and he doesn't? The answer is equally simple, and it has nothing to do with the law, and nothing to do with celebrity, and nothing to do with being 6'4" with broad hands and 27 years of a career that made you the most recognized face in the country. It has to do with the arithmetic of what's in front of you. It has to do with knowing the difference between what you're entitled to and what you owe. It has to do with understanding that a reputation built on doing the right thing only when it costs nothing is not a reputation at all. One man standing in one doorway on one Tuesday morning in November. One decision that nobody photographed, nobody published, and that almost nobody knew about for decades. One lesson that 340 families in Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico received, through a restructured loan, through a modified payment schedule, through a second chance at staying open, without ever knowing where it started. John Wayne never spoke publicly about what happened in Sheridan, Wyoming in November of 1961. There's no studio record of it, no publicity file, no press release. But there is one other story from that same period. One conversation that reportedly happened 3 weeks after the parking lot in Sheridan, in a very different setting, with a very different kind of man, that Wayne also never spoke about publicly. And the reason he stayed silent about that one has nothing to do with modesty. That's a story for another time.